Open your Bibles this morning, if you would, to Matthew 5. We are continuing with our methodical and challenging, but ultimately very fruitful examination of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, starting at verse 27 and going until the end of verse 30. Ye have heard that it was said of them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. Pray the Lord adds his blessing to that reading. So last week, we looked at the first sub-point within Jesus' primary sermon point. And his primary sermon point is this: there's none righteous. There's none righteous. You would have to have a righteousness that exceeds that of the most righteous men in the land. Well, let me really peel back the layers then. Let me really expose the fact that the kind of righteousness that his listeners were being told that they had to pursue, because these were the scribes and Pharisees were not just the religious leaders, they were the religious teachers. Jesus says the kind of righteousness that you have been instructed to pursue is ultimately hollow. I will tell you the kind of righteousness that you must have. And then here's the real kicker. By the time he ends this first point with all of these sub-point examples within it, by the time he gets to the end of chapter 5, here's the main point. You can't do it. The righteousness that is actually demanded by God's law is a bar set so high that no man or woman can ever achieve it. Now you hear that, and perhaps this morning you think, that is really unfair of God. That is really unfair of him to put the goalposts so far out of our reach. But it's not unfair. Our sinfulness and our small-mindedness as human beings makes it seem unfair. The law is reflective of God's character. And if we learn one thing, and one thing only, I hope we learn more than one thing, but if you only walk away with one lesson through this examination, it is an understanding of the high holiness of God. Because the law he gave reflects his character. It should be the kind of thing that we cannot achieve on our own. If we could, we would be like him. The purpose of the law is in fact to present us with this reality, that there exists an uncrossable gulf between sinful mankind and holy God. We can't get there on our own. We can't come into his presence through our own works. We cannot make ourselves righteous enough. We cannot clean up our lives enough. We cannot divest ourselves of the thoughts and sin that stain us. We can't get rid of it. Not on our own. What is needed is someone to do it for us. What is needed is a mediator, to employ a legal term. What is needed is someone to save us. And so the purpose of God's law, the reason that it is intentionally set so far out of our reach, is because it reveals the holiness of God and the utter lack of holiness in mankind. Now we come to the second sub-point within this first point. And keep in mind, remember, we are still talking about righteousness. And namely, how you must have a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the guys who seem to be the most righteous people in all the land. But they're actually not. We have mentioned before that these were not just the religious leaders in the land, they were the religious teachers. And Jesus is correcting their teaching, which is why all of these examples are set up with a similar structure. You have heard it said, and then he tells you what it is that they have heard it said from the scribes, from the Pharisees. In other words, this is what you have been taught, but I say unto you. Then he comes in with a total contradiction. That, we need to remind ourselves, does not undermine, change, or overthrow, or in his words, destroy the law. Rather, Jesus comes in with something that contradicts the teaching, while at the same time opens up the full dimensions of God's law. The full height, the full depth, the full breadth, the full implications of it. So here Jesus says, it has been, you have been told, right? You have been taught. Ye have heard that it was said of them of the old time, that is, not just this generation of scribes and Pharisees, but all the preceding generations of scribes and Pharisees and very wise, learned men who have put their biblical commentaries, such as they were, down. Well, this is what you've been taught. You have heard that it was said of them in the old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now let's just pause here at the end of verse 27, because again, like the first point, you've been taught you shall not commit murder. This is technically true. This is actually very technically true. And it is not a wrong or a false teaching. What is being taught, what has been taught, is Exodus 20:14. This is the 7th of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. That's Exodus 20:14. That's the whole verse. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So, to a certain extent, the scribes and Pharisees are teaching true. The penalty for committing adultery is actually in the next book over from Exodus. It's in Leviticus. Leviticus 20, verse 10, has this. And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Very interesting. This penalty was actually repeated again in Deuteronomy 22. Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, if a man be found lying with a woman married to an husband, then they shall both of them die. Both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So shalt thou put away evil from Israel. Now maybe we look at this, we go, well, that is just blatantly unfair. A man commits adultery with another man's wife and then they both get killed? Well, that doesn't seem fair. Surely the man should be killed. Well, no. God says here, twice, you shall not commit adultery. And through the penalties he prescribes for committing adultery, he backs up something that I think we could all agree with. It takes two to tango. In every act of adultery, there is an adulterer and an adulteress. And so they are both equally guilty. And the punishment is death. Death for both of them. That is the only way, here to go back to Deuteronomy 22:22, by doing this, by making such an example of such people, that is how you will put away evil from Israel. In other words, people will see that and they will get the message. Well, what message will they get? Don't commit adultery? Maybe the message would be, don't get caught in adultery. No. The message that is meant to be taken away is that this is how high and exalted God holds up the institute of marriage. That those who defile it and make a mockery of it are deserving of death. There used to be a saying when I was a kid, and I don't think I hear it used very often, right? The sanctity of marriage. That is, marriage is a sacred thing. It is a sanctified thing. It is a thing, to employ the full meaning of that word, it is a thing set apart from the world for God's use. It is a sacred institution. And there was a time and an age where we were terrified to break it, whether through adultery or through divorce, both of which have become ridiculously commonplace for us now. They've become so commonplace, we have actually cheapened marriage. Looking at marriage stats in Canada over the past 5 years, at a quick look, it might appear to be good news. It looks actually on the surface as if divorce rates are falling. Are people becoming more committed to their relationships? Are people taking their marriages more seriously? Well, no. When we dig, we simply find that fewer and fewer people are even bothering to get married in the first place. And if you're not married, you can't get divorced. So what is being brought back out into the light of day here by Jesus is the true height and the true depth and the true implications of marriage. Well, none of that was being taught. What was being taught was the letter of the law. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Fine. You're a married man, you're a married woman, you refrain from entering into a sexual relationship with someone other than your spouse, much like saying, hey, I've never killed anybody, I'm doing pretty good. The same might have been something that one of the hearers of this sermon would have said. Listen, I've never cheated on my wife. I have never cheated on my husband. Therefore, according to what I have been taught, according to the men who are the paragons of righteousness in the land, as far as this part of fulfilling God's law goes, I'm okay. And Jesus says, not so fast. Because it's more than just the act. It is the heart. Just as you can't say, yeah, maybe I've never killed anybody, but you've certainly harbored anger and hatred towards a person. Jesus says that is tantamount to murder. Same thing here. You may be able to quite rightly say, and quite truthfully say, I've never committed adultery, but have you ever looked on someone and lusted after them? Verse 28, but I say unto you, right? You've heard this, but I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already. You say, Jesus, no, it was totally hands off. Jesus says it's not about the hands. He has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Once again, the law of God exposes the deficiencies, the woeful deficiencies of the human heart. That's a real problem, because it is the condition of the human heart that ultimately keeps us apart from God. And if we want to become citizens of God's kingdom, then something's got to be done about the heart. Which ties back to this point that Jesus is making. There are men here, the scribes and the Pharisees, and it looks as if they have righteous hearts. But Jesus says, let me tell you, they absolutely do not. And to make it worse, not only are they headed for hell, but they are dragging you folks along with them because they are teaching you incompletely, if not incorrectly. They are teaching you incompletely. There is more to the breaking of God's law than simply committing a sexual act outside of the marriage covenant. See, what Jesus does here says, you have heard for generations, you have heard the seventh commandment trumpeted. But I say unto you that the seventh commandment is intrinsically connected to the 10th. What's that 10th commandment? Refresh our memories. Exodus 20:17. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, nor shalt thou covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Now, covet is not really a word that we use very much. By the book, covet means this: a yearning, to possess or have something. Insert the something here. Coveting is not an action per se. It is a verb. People do it. People covet. People want. The grass is always greener on the other side. But it is something that can be done apart from physical action. You can stand in the middle of a crowded room and covet, and no one would ever be much the wiser. It's hands off. It can take place at a distance. And so to simply say, I didn't touch her, to simply say, he and I never did anything, is not enough. The adultery takes place not in the hand, but in the heart. Proverbs 23:7. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. For as he thinketh, you are what you think in the heart. And so maybe you haven't killed anyone, and maybe you haven't physically broken your marriage vows. But harboring hate and anger is the same as murder, and thinking lustful thoughts towards someone who is not your spouse is the same thing as adultery. It's all about the heart. It's all about the heart. It's in fact always been about the heart. This is not a New Testament change in God's thinking. 1 Samuel 16:7. Now this is where Samuel has come. He's come to Jesse and his sons to anoint the king, or rather the future king, and it's going to be David. But he doesn't come to David first. He actually comes to David last because David is out tending the sheep. He comes first to David's very good-looking, strapping, kingly, they carry themselves as kings, all of his brothers. And no, they're all passed over. Why? Because here at verse 7, God looks on the heart. God looks on the heart. Actually, you know what? Just let me pull that up for you. 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel comes to David's older brother Eliab. Here it is, verse 6. And it came to pass that when they were come, right, all of David's brothers have assembled here in the field, that Samuel looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Right? Eliab is just, he's so kingly looking that even Samuel, even this great prophet of God, is like, that has totally got to be the guy. Look at him. He's got Hollywood good looks. I mean, if you assembled a king, from a... If you had 30 writers, give me something that, right? He's just the perfect looking king. But then the Lord actually corrects Samuel here at verse 7. But the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. Right? Ignore his Hollywood good looks. Ignore his height. Ignore how broad his shoulders are, the squareness of his jaw. Whatever it was that Eliab had going for him. It seems he had everything going for him. His fine head of hair. Just ignore it, God says. I don't actually look on any of it. It's all external. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. Man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. And this, friends, is one of the great stumbling blocks with us today. Because ours is an especially pornographic society. I mean that scholastically, from a Greek word porneia, which is just bad, wrongful, sexually bad. Fewer and fewer people are getting married, while at the same time more and more people are just choosing to live with each other. And society says that's fine. And the church is oddly and increasingly mum on the subject as well. But this is a pornographic society. This society is ever increasingly aiming its burning arrows against the sanctity and even the institution of marriage. Which of course leads us to the great elephant in the room this morning, actual pornography. If there is one thing in our lives here as contemporary 21st century Canadians and as contemporary 21st century Christian Canadians, it is pornography. Because I cannot think of anything else in our lives or society today that causes this sin of the heart and the eye, while at the same time remaining completely hands off and at a distance. It comes to us through our televisions. It comes to us through our magazines. It comes to us over the internet. So let me take the shine off it this morning. We're giving you some statistics that I looked up. These are very depressing. Some of these are all within the past 5 years, all within about 2016 up until today. 1 in 5 youth pastors and 1 in 7 senior pastors surveyed use pornography on a regular basis and are currently struggling with their doing so. Someone crunched the numbers and said that that equals 50,000 U.S. church leaders. These are American numbers. That's 1 in 5 youth pastors. 1 in 7 senior pastors. 50,000 church leaders are actually committing adultery in God's eyes. 43% of senior pastors and youth pastors say they've struggled with pornography in their past. 64% of Christian men and 15% of Christian women say that they watch porn at least once a month. See, it would be an absolute mistake and another lie that society maybe wants to paint this over with to say that pornography is a man's issue. It's only men. No, pornography is a problem that afflicts both sexes. 43% of pastors have struggled with this, and only 7% of pastors report that their church ministry has any kind of program in place to help those struggling with porn. That's pornography within the church. Let me give you some about pornography in marriage. 68% of divorce cases today involve one party meeting a new lover over the internet. 56% involved one party having, quote, an obsessive interest in pornographic websites. 70% of wives of sex addicts, right? Your husband is diagnosed as a sex addict. 70% of those wives were diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's how stressful it is on the marriage. And of course, it goes without saying that pornography engenders diminished trust between once intimate couples. It marks a lack of attraction to family and even child raising, and I found this point the most pertinent. It engenders the belief that promiscuity is the natural state of things. It makes us think, hey, everybody's like this. Hey, everybody does this. This is not something to get bothered over by. It's not that wrong. Well, Jesus here would strongly beg to differ. It is adultery. It has no physical ties, but it is adultery nonetheless. 40 million Americans, according to this research, 40 million Americans are regular visitors to porn sites. See, it comes over in tangible forms. And society would make you say that this is okay. And society, incidentally, would not be, again, this is not, there's nothing new under the sun. Excuse me. 1 Corinthians 6:13. Now, there was some of the church in Corinth, and they had come out of a really pornographic society. You used to be able to go to the Temple of Diana and have prostitutes as part and parcel of your worship. It was a society that was just rife with all kinds of sexual ungodliness. And now some of those people had become Christians. And in the church at Corinth, they were having a really hard time leaving that past life behind them. They were bringing their worldly habits and their worldly views into their new lives in the church, and it was causing all kinds of problems. And we know this from 1 Corinthians 6:13, where Paul says you've got a saying. There's a saying floating around your church, and it's here at verse 13, meats for the belly and the belly for meats. In other words, gluttony is fine. Eating is not a sin. We are made for eating. Well, it's just, it's in our genes. It's who we are. It's a natural part of who we are. Well, Paul says, that may be what they say around your parts, but I say to you, God shall destroy both it and them. He will destroy both the belly and those who say these things. Why? The body is not meant for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. In other words, you who are Christians, you are no longer your own. You have been purchased. You've been purchased by the blood of Christ, which means that you are now owned. You belong to the Lord now. Your body is not yours to do with as you please. Your body is now the Lord's, and you will do with it as He pleases. And that's just everyday life. This is actually compounded within a marriage. Within a marriage, there is actually an additional layer of ownership. Your body not only belongs to the Lord, brothers and sisters, your body belongs to your spouse. It's doubly not yours. Genesis 2:24. Eve is made out of Adam's rib, and this sets a precedent for all the generations following after Adam and Eve, including me and you. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Jesus quoted this again in Matthew's Gospel, at Matthew 19:5, when he brought it up in a discussion, a very heated discussion with the Pharisees on the issue of divorce. God has designed marriage. That's why it's so precious to Him. It's His invention. And He has designed it to be a high and holy thing. Which is why it is so offensive to Him when it is so casually and consistently denigrated. Adultery is offensive to God because it takes what is His and it joins it to what it should not be joined to. In effect, adultery drags God into a sinful situation. Paul writes that it marries, it joins the Christian. When a Christian, say, hires a prostitute, that's the example he's using, that you are actually, it's not just you and the prostitute, you are enjoining Christ to a prostitute. How dare you do that to Christ? Well, the same thing can be said here of marriage. How dare you take that which God has intended to be wonderful and pure and defile it? And don't you dare say, oh, it's just who we are, it's just who we're put together, just how things are. The only unregenerate people say that. And even then, they don't get away with that excuse. That's just what they say. Sin is not the action. The action is the result. Sin begins with the thought. No regimen of self-denial can change that. Only a supernatural act of God can change the heart. Which is why we have here the evangelistic cry. Which is why once a person's shortcoming before the law is made clear, that we can get to the next step. When they say, well, what am I going to do about this? And our answer is, you must be born again. You must have a total cleansing of the heart, which only God can do. Preaching on these same verses back in the 1950s, the late 1950s, British preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones said this, quote, "The essence of evangelism is to start by preaching the law. And it is because the law has not been preached that we have had so much superficial evangelism. Go through the ministry of our Lord Himself, and you cannot help but get the impression that at times, far from pressing people to follow Him and decide for Him, He put great obstacles in their way. He said, in effect, do you realize what you are doing? Have you counted the cost? Do you realize where it may lead you? Do you know that it means denying yourself, taking up your cross daily and following me? True evangelism, I say, because of this doctrine of sin, must always start by preaching the law," close quote. Now, is Jesus here, as we finish up with the rest of these, talking about plucking out your eye, cutting off your hand? These have been problematic verses for eons. Is Jesus here advocating, how do we deal with this? Is he advocating a puritanical, a Victorian kind of way of dealing with this? We'll cover up all the piano legs. We'll put on blinders. We will gouge out our eyes, right? If I can't see, I can't sin. Will we cut off the extremities that lead us to sin, whether it's our hands or anything else? Origen of Alexandria, he lived from 184 to 253. He was an early Christian scholar and an ascetic and a theologian, very, very brilliant man. However, he had this absolutely wrong. He was so convicted by these curses, he went and had himself castrated. He plucked out far more than the eye. He cut off far more than the hand. But the idea was the same. If I haven't got it, it can't lead me into sin. But the extremity is not the thing that leads into sin. It is the heart. Well, no. Jesus, to answer our question, is not advocating that you literally pluck out your eye, that you literally cut off your hand or incidentally cut off anything else. That is not God's will, because as we have already established, that would just be another abuse of the body, and the body belongs to the Lord. So clearly Jesus is not advocating mutilation as a solution. What he is describing here is the radicalness with which we must put this away. Remember that word from last week. We must mortify. Certainly, these thoughts and impulses and desires will arise in all of us, and especially in marriage. Satan wants to undermine marriage so badly. He hates it because God loves it, you see. Satan's biggest guns, his most destructive ammunition is always reserved against that which God upholds. Those are the things he hates the most. He hates the church. He hates you coming to salvation. And he hates your marriage. He will do anything to undermine and destroy the marriage, including a cultural narrative that says, as long as I'm not actually touching another woman, as long as I'm not actually in bed with another man, maybe it's just coming to me over the internet or through the airwaves, that's fine. Meat's for the belly, and the belly for meats. But Jesus says you are not allowed to hide behind that kind of excuse. You are not allowed to say this is just how it is. This is just how people are put together. Society says it's okay. It says don't listen to them, listen to me. Listen to what I say. And I say that violation of your marriage covenant is a thing that offends God so much that he's going to say it twice, here at the ends of 29 and here at the ends of 30. It is worth casting you into hell because you have violated and ultimately sullied that which God calls sanctified. We need to uphold our marriages again as shining examples that run countercultural in every way, shape, and form. And if it means that we need to take radical steps in order to preserve the sanctity of our marriage, then that's what we need to do. You need to cut off your internet. Jesus says, do that. Better that you should never post on Twitter again than violate your marriage. If you need to cancel your satellite or get rid of your television, do that. Better that you should not know what's happening on all of the shows this fall. Far better that you should just be culturally ignorant than ruin your marriage and condemn yourself, your whole body, to an eternity in hell. This is a dire warning here. I mean, there are many of us that can say, I've never killed a man. But go back to those statistics. There are not so many who can say, I have not committed adultery. Therefore, let the Christian marriage be held up as the true and proper example, something which we will only be able to do through continual commitment to it and the mortification of all of those things which would naturally come against it, whether from without or more insidiously from within.